That's a very kind introduction, Jody. Thank you. But there are many there's still a good number of stars in the sociological firmament. But you're right, not as many as there were back, for instance, in the 60s and 70s. And that's, that's a tragedy, hopefully one that will be kind of remedied in the coming years. But I want to begin just by acknowledging that I am coming from the University of Virginia, where I've been learning, living, and teaching for more than 20 years, really literally in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson. My home in Charlottesville kind of sits below Jefferson's home, Monticello, and then I walk across kind of campus at UVA, we call it grounds at UVA, and Jefferson's statue is there as well. So again, I'm kind of living, learning, and teaching in Jefferson's shadow. He's famous, of course, for many things, for founding the university, for building Monticello, and for leading our nation as an early president. But probably most famous for being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, where he talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness. So on that particular phrase, as a kind of piece of our American civilization, we can ask this question of the room right now. Just a quick show of hands here. Who would like to be happy? The vast majority of the room wants to be happy here in Boulder, Colorado. But as we think about sort of how we're doing in the country at large when it comes to this classic pursuit, I think we have to sort of face the facts. And the facts are is that we're not doing very well. This kind of headline from ABC News gives you kind of some news from Gallup kind of tracking this issue, but there are kind of many different surveys that are kind of leading us to conclude that more and more Americans are failing at that kind of classic pursuit. This is a different survey and kind of a study coming out of Dartmouth, just showing us here that happiness is down kind of across the board, but particularly for the younger adults in this country. Younger adults in the back of the room here today. So again, we're not doing so well in this country right now when it comes to this pursuit. And I want to suggest to you this evening that the kind of biggest factors that tend to sort of dominate the conversation in the public square, in America, are actually not closely related to this new social challenge, this decline in happiness across America. So it's not primarily about anything to do with race, this particular issue. It's not actually related to, the sort of a shift to shifts in poverty, because actually poverty is down. It's not related to immigration. And sorry to disappoint the econ majors here, but it's not related to kind of the marginal tax rate either. Okay? This isn't about taxes, tonight's topic. And actually, just as a side note, Jody was mentioning that sociology was once kind of the biggest major on college campuses, and today, at least at UVA, it's econ. That's now the new kind of top major. But again, on this issue, we're not seeing a close relationship between the tax rate and happiness in America. So what is the kind of big issue? Well, from my perspective, the biggest factor driving this troubling trend, as we'll see tonight, is what I call the kind of closing of the American heart. What do I mean by this? I mean that our capacity to forge meaningful relationships in the real world with real people is cratering today in our society, especially among younger adults. And I'm going to be focusing in particular this evening on growing difficulties we're seeing, we're witnessing when it comes to love and marriage and starting a family. Okay, so when it comes, for instance, to dating, there is what we've just called in a new report this week, a kind of dating recession afoot. In this case, we've got high school students, but we're sort of seeing similar trends when it comes to young adults more generally. Okay, so this obviously is kind of a fundamental kind of pathway into love, if you will, or expression of love. And then we're seeing as well that marriage is down in America by about 60% in terms of the marriage rate since 1970. Now, this all might seem to you a little bit abstract, these kinds of statistics. So I want to kind of also have anyone here whose last name begins with N to Z, just to briefly stand up. Okay. Thank you. You can sit down now. And I kind of did that exercise just to kind of signal to you that we're now projecting demographically that 1 in 3 young adults in their 20s, again, 1 in 3 young adults in their 20s will never marry, will be permanent bachelors, permanent bachelorettes. We've kind of never been in a moment in our culture, in our society, demographically, where so many people are going to be, either unable or uninterested or unwilling to marry in this kind of newer moment we're moving into. So again, this is kind of another expression of this closing of the American heart unfolding, before us. And this leads to the next sobering statistic, which is about 1/4 of today's young adults are projected never to have children. So again, less dating, less marriage, and less childbearing is what we're seeing across the country. So why should we be concerned that the American heart is closing? There are certainly plenty of voices in the academy who aren't concerned about this, this larger pattern that we're seeing. I'm thinking of the NYU sociologist, for instance, Eric Klinenberg, the author of the book Going Solo. And in an interview with the New York Times, he could not muster a negative word about the falling fortunes of marriage and family in America. He said, among other things, quote, "For young professionals, it being singleness, is a sign of success and a mark of distinction, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating." Ah, yes, success, anonymity, freedom, these are the keys to meaning and happiness, is kind of, I think, the implication here. But I would suggest to you tonight that in a nation that I think is going to be marked potentially by rising economic precarity, if the CEO of Anthropic is at all kind of on the money, in a society where too many of us are glued to our screens, addicted to the electronic opiates that make so many of us anxious and depressed, and in a country where community is crumbling and loneliness is rising, okay? So it's in this particular economic, technological, and social context that I want to suggest to you tonight that it's not just the case that love and marriage and family matter, and I've been kind of beating that drum for many, many years, as Jody knows, is that they actually matter more than ever, okay? So again, the claim I'm making in part tonight is that love, marriage, and family matter more than ever for the welfare of the younger adults here, who are, again, primarily in the back, compared to those of us who are older. And that's because marriage and family are more likely to be kind of relatively rare as sources of solidarity for them, in part, and meaning, in part. Now, I've been talking too about kind of the pursuit of happiness, and I'm suggesting that these things are important for the pursuit of happiness in today's America, and probably more than ever as we go forward. Now, when it comes to happiness, I need to say something more about that pursuit. A lot of us, I think including me, are tempted to think about happiness as coming from pursuing our desires and our projects. For pleasure, for money, for power, for fame, for professional success. As the constitutional scholar Jeff Rosen has written, quote, "Today we think of happiness as the pursuit of pleasure, but classical and Enlightenment thinkers defined happiness as the pursuit of virtue, as being good rather than feeling good." And clearly you get a sense that Jefferson was kind of thinking about happiness and the pursuit of happiness in that more classical way in this quote, as did I think many of our founders. But I want to kind of push past kind of Jefferson's view on this particular issue of happiness and its pursuit, and to suggest to you tonight that Jefferson, I think in some ways, missed something. He missed, I think, how much kind of the pursuit of happiness really is about the practice and the experience of virtue in the context of family, kind of within the fabric of the family. And here we could think about John Adams as another founder being probably a better kind of teacher in this way, or in this on this topic. And the point here in part is that we need to understand that we are social animals, as Aristotle said. We're hardwired to connect. And this means that our ties with others, especially friends and family, end up being crucial to our welfare. They afford meaning, direction, and a sense of solidarity. And again, so many opportunities to grow in virtue. Okay. And so my own work in my new book, Get Married, looks, for instance, at the association between happiness, as it's sort of expressed by ordinary Americans, and different kinds of endeavors and different kinds of achievements. And what we see is that, yes, a college degree, it's good news for many of the college students here, is linked to greater happiness. Yes, a decent income is linked to greater happiness. Yes, having a satisfying job is linked to greater happiness. But we can see here that simply being married is a better predictor of happiness for women and men than these other things, and especially kind of forging a good relationship in the context of your marriage is a particularly powerful predictor of happiness for ordinary Americans. In fact, there's no variable in this particular large data set, it's called the General Social Survey, that is as powerful in predicting adult happiness as is the quality of one's marriage. Okay, so it's kind of just telling us that, again, when it comes to this pursuit of happiness, that probably love, marriage, and family are pretty important. This is kind of just a quick sense of some of the research that I've done. You can get kind of a similar story, too, from the Harvard study of adult development, too, that kind of also concludes that our friendships and our family relationships are a lot more important for our happiness than a lot of the things that we're preoccupied with today in our culture. But I also kind of see this, too, when I talk to ordinary young adults, especially 30-somethings who have experienced difficulty in kind of moving into love and marriage and family. I'm thinking of young adults like Taylor, a graphic designer who lives not far from here. She was told to focus on her career in her 20s, but this graphic designer in Denver now regrets that. Could I look back on that advice and I'm like, you know, if I could do it again, I would actually focus on finding a husband a little bit earlier, she told me. Her single state is especially hard for her because she feels like she, quote, doesn't have a ton of meaning in her life right now. By contrast, the time she spends babysitting for her nieces and nephews, which she loves, has left her thinking that she would be more fulfilled if she were married with children. The notion that life is all about work, quote, bugs me the older I get, because I'm like, I spent so much time believing that. And I'm like, you know, is there a chance that I could have a family of my own right now? You know, do fun things with them, figure paint, whatever. I don't know what kids do, okay? Now, to be clear, we all know that there are plenty of singles who are flourishing, and there are plenty of married folks who are floundering, right? But we are seeing kind of empirically, especially for kind of younger adults, sort of broadly defined, that unhappiness is ticking up, especially for unmarried women and men. In this case, folks in their 20s and 30s, basically, in recent years. And my own new research is kind of finding that this growing difference is statistically significant. Okay, so the point I'm making in part again is that it looks like marriage matters more than ever for the pursuit of happiness. It's kind of part of the point here. And the work of the economist Sam Peltzman also suggests to us, as he kind of looks at the broader shifts across the entire adult landscape in the United States, the shifts away from happiness, that the number one factor in his analysis is the fact that fewer and fewer Americans are either putting a ring on it or sort of managing to keep their marriages together. So again, this is kind of telling us that this closing of the American heart has been consequential for happiness in America. So what's going on? Why is it that Americans are experiencing more difficulty in the sort of departments of love and marriage and family? And there's obviously a ton of things that we could say about this this issue, this challenge facing the country. I'm going to hit on 3 cultural and technological roots of the problem, hopefully fairly briefly, and then wrap up with some suggestions about what young adults can do in this newer context. So I think one of the challenges facing us is that too many adults, too many young adults, too many teenagers actually have kind of been embracing what I call the Midas mindset. And this is particularly, I think, a challenge for young adults who are kind of becoming more educated and are kind of already affluent or are kind of headed to affluence as they kind of move into adulthood. And so the thought here is that they may be kind of chasing things that are not as important as the things that should be more important in their lives, kind of chasing the wrong things. And in particular, as I think about the Midas mindset, the thought here is that we were being told today by the media, by the academy, and by the pop culture that we should be steering a path away from marriage and family and towards mammon, especially in our 20s, towards money, towards work, towards the unencumbered life. So life is about working hard and playing hard is kind of the thought here, right? It's not about finding love, getting married, settling down, and having a family, especially in your 20s. In other words, our culture is telling us that the pursuit of happiness comes from the pursuit of pleasure and status, not from the pursuit of virtuous love in the context of marriage and family. And there are kind of a number of examples that we could think about. From the left, really targeting women, we've got writers like Amy Shern, writing in the New York Times, saying that, quote, married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. She's writing from Brooklyn, they're always seemingly from Brooklyn, okay? But again, she is a progressive targeting women with a sort of kind of anti-nuptial message. But we're also seeing now right-wing kind of influencers and thinkers doing this as well. And which right-wing influencer is making a similar argument, but targeting men that you're kind of aware of?
That creepy looks-maxer guy?
Andrew Tate, yes, that's the one. I don't know about the looks-maxer guy. I'm not sure if that's. Okay. So kind of folks on the kind of what's been called the red pill right, people like Pearl Davis and Andrew Tate are kind of basically saying, marriage is not a good deal for guys. Pearl Davis says it's a death sentence for men, and Andrew Tate says that there is zero statistical advantage for men when it comes to marriage today. So again, kind of voices on the left and the right kind of discounting the value of marriage and really love in a sense too as well. Also the pop culture is kind of sending us a message too that's sort of reinforcing the value of the unencumbered life. If you really want to have fun, if you want to travel, if you want to enjoy a Sunday brunch without being disturbed by the cry of an infant or the scream of a toddler, better just to kind of steer clear of that family stuff and live like Emily does in Paris. Okay. And then we see this expressed by university students, like my student Holly graduated from UVA a few years ago, and she talked about how UVA students are definitely, quote, more focused on their education and getting their career started and getting into a serious relationship, going on to say, basically, the thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you'll always have your career and success to fall back on. Okay, that's the thought, right? And this kind of Midas mindset is kind of suffused throughout just tons of Pew polls, like this one here, targeting teenagers, which kind of shows us that they think the path to fulfillment runs really through a job or career that one would enjoy, not through kind of marriage and family, or not as much. There's a minority, but a much larger minority of teenagers are kind of placing their faith, in a future related to work. So I think this Midas mindset is one of the cultural kind of factors that's sort of pushing folks away from prioritizing love and marriage and family, especially in their 20s. Okay, the second thing that I'll talk about is just the way in which we're kind of seeing a deepening sexual divide between young women and young men. It's in some ways more consequential for working class Americans, I would say. And the point is that it's increasingly difficult for young men and young women to find common ground, not to mention romance in our society today. And part of the challenge here is about what I call the male malaise, where both teenage boys and young and even prime-aged men are having greater difficulty when it comes to sort of flourishing today. They're more likely to kind of fail to launch, into adulthood in their 20s, sometimes even into their 30s. We see this kind of around us, literally, with many more women in college than men, and also with young men saying things like this guy did to the Wall Street Journal, quote, "I just feel lost," unquote. Kind of talking about why he is not in college, why he's not on the college track, okay? We see a large minority of guys who are not working full-time, and this pattern is especially common for guys who do not have a college degree. Again, kind of suggesting this is sort of affecting working class young men more than, more educated young men in some ways. We're also seeing too many guys who are not in shape as well. And that's part of the sort of the pattern here. And then too many younger men who are kind of having difficulties when it comes to relationships, kind of, among other things, kind of inaugurating, a relationship. So only 1 in 3 young men ages 22 to 35, based upon a study we just came out with this week, are dating right now, which obviously makes it harder to kind of move into love and marriage and family as well. So in kind of talking about this pattern, we have Professor Scott Galloway, who has a new book out on boys and men. And I'm going to see if we can just listen in to a little bit of his conversation on this, because it's pretty, I think, on the money.
Because they're lonely and lost and feel that they are not useful in society. How did we get there?
The most unstable nations in the world have one thing in common, and that is they have too many lonely, broke, and alone men. It's the most dangerous person in the world. Salman Rushdie wasn't attacked because of the fatwa. He was attacked because a guy was living in his mother's basement. We have a crisis among young men, and it starts at a young age. Young men are twice as likely on a behavior-adjusted basis to be suspended. 7 in 10 high school valedictorians are women. For every 2 female graduates from college in the next 5 years, you only have 1. The scariest stat, walking down the avenue that is America, only 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 have had sex in the last year. And you hear sex and your brain fires, but the bottom line is, it's a key step to the elemental foundation of any society, and that is relationships. Young men aren't attaching to work, they aren't attaching to women, they aren't attaching to schools. We are producing too many of the most dangerous person in society, and we are losing out on a key. We're not gonna have kids, we're not gonna have a productive society, we're gonna have more violence, and also we're gonna have a society that does not value young men, and they do not. Young men are different, they develop later, and by the way, if you're a young man, this work from home thing is a disaster. They need, young men need guardrails. They need to know how to read a room, they need to put on a clean shirt, they know not to get high or drink too much during the week, and then get into the office the next day. We have a crisis among young men. It is one of the most, in my view, one of the most dangerous things in our society.
And where do you put the phone in this equation? Because I put it high up. Because, thank you. Because I was reading recently, Tinder, 2 to 1 male to female.
Oh.
What?
No, it's just a startling statistic, yeah.
Right. But why is it startling? I mean, it sounds like a great idea. Oh, I can just order women like I do a pizza on my phone. I think I'll have the Kelly today. Except when you go on it, it weeds out the people who aren't the best looking, I think, because it used to be go to a bar, okay, maybe it was potluck, but you have to be able to learn to 100%. Talk to a woman. I don't think they had to talk to a woman anymore, because it's just on the phone. It's just like, what's up? And then, what's up, and send a picture of your penis. Like, that's gonna work.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
You asked about the phone. Simply put, it's a disaster. Whenever technology comes into an industry, it consolidates it. Mating has been consolidated in the worst way. 50 men on Tinder, 50 women. 46 of the women show all of their attention to just 4 men, leaving 46 men pursuing just 4 women. If mating was a country, it would be more unequal than Venezuela.
Okay, so he's talking about the impact of the phone. We could talk too about kind of just the broader, what we call kind of the addiction economy, which is like everything from basically pornography to gambling to gaming now, and how these different sort of sectors of the economy, often kind of run by some of our biggest and richest companies in the US, are kind of degrading young men's capacity to flourish. We could talk about how, you know, too many of our schools are really kind of not tailoring their ethos and their content to the way in which boys learn and have their, you know, minds sort of brought to the subject at hand. We could talk to you about how we haven't really offered a kind of constructive model of masculinity for men in this country for a very long time. So there are a bunch of factors that help to explain why young men and teenage boys are more likely to be floundering. But the point I want to make here in part is that this sort of male malaise is problematic because it does mean that there are fewer young men who are kind of likely to be successful when it comes to protecting. And it's still the case in 2026 that women like guys who are more physically strong and sort of project a kind of capacity to be protective. They still also like guys who do well enough, you know, at a job, who would be kind of reliable, again, providers. And they're also, of course, looking for guys who are good at paying attention, you know, kind of can be empathetic, can be affectionate, can be grateful, and can kind of leave, you know, their devices on, you know, on the table or the counter and kind of engage them well. So the dynamics we're talking about with young men have made it harder for, you know, them to sort of move into the dating and relationship space successfully for reasons we can appreciate. And this also then leads to, for the women, what I'm calling kind of Amazonian detachment. For some, you know, a minority, but still a notable minority. And the Amazons, of course, were a legendary nation of warrior women in Greek mythology who lived independently in an all-female society. They were skilled fighters who rejected traditional female roles, keeping men only for occasional relationships. They lived lives marked by skepticism and even hostility towards men. They were free of family encumbrances, and they had a strong sisterhood. So we're kind of seeing kind of pieces of this pattern for younger women as well kind of playing out. There was an article by Anna Sussman, a prominent female journalist in the New York Times, kind of basically complaining about the state of men and saying that, you know, men do not measure up in her New York Times piece. And, you know, obviously even the illustration in the New York Times was kind of really making the point very powerfully visually. She was complaining about drug and alcohol abuse on the part of men. She was saying that when younger men go on dates, they're relatively, quote, limited in their ability and willingness to be fully emotionally present and available. Okay, so this is kind of her perspective. It's the perspective of a growing number of young women that I speak to. And again, I'm not saying all men. I'm just saying that there's a larger share of young men who, in their estimation, don't measure up to their standards. Okay, and that leads to frustration and to some extent, a kind of maybe a willingness to sort of move in that more Amazonian direction. We're obviously seeing political differences too, right? Where young women are frustrated with the fact that some of the guys in their networks or that they're dating are supporters of Donald Trump, for instance. I talked to a woman, for instance, in the Mid-Atlantic in her late 20s, and she had 2 failed relationships that were, she seemingly maybe on the pathway to marriage because of this political divide. They were supportive of Donald Trump and she was not. So this was kind of a frustration for her, a problem for her from her perspective. And so some women are kind of, in this context, kind of giving up on dating, love, and marriage and focusing on their female friendships. We see also too in Pew that 39% of young single women are not even looking to date. So again, a kind of more Amazonian detachment emerging for a variety of frustration with men, political differences, you know, other things that are kind of leading a decent sized minority of women to kind of disengage. So again, the second idea I'm talking about tonight in terms of explaining where we're at is that there's this growing sexual divide that's sort of separating women and men, younger women and men especially, from one another. And the third thing I'll just quickly mention here is that I think the digital revolution is deeply implicated in all of this, okay? And so what it's doing is it's degrading an adult's social skills, okay? So people are spending a lot more time online, but not in person. And so they're less able, in Scott Galloway's terms, to kind of read a room, for instance, to engage in meaningful conversation, and just to kind of connect socially, which has obvious implications for dating, love, and marriage. We're seeing also too how ideologically the digital revolution is dividing young men and women from one another as well. And so just kind of two examples of this, obviously, right? One is kind of the OnlyFans boom, which I would say is both kind of a cause and a consequence of, you know, what's happening in terms of both this digital revolution and this growing divide between the sexes. Okay. And then too, on the political front, I did a piece in The Atlantic with a colleague, Lyman Stone, just showing too here that for single adults age 18 to 30, women are moving more to the left and men are moving more in a conservative direction. And this obviously creates some tensions. It's really kind of played out, especially since this digital revolution has been unfolding in, you know, in America. So these cultural and technological shifts, I think, help to explain why we are seeing the American heart closing. And I also just want to kind of note, too, that I think because these devices have gone global, many of the things that I'm talking about are applicable across the globe in countries as different as Tunisia, Turkey, and Thailand, where they're seeing dramatic declines in marriage and coupling and fertility. I think because of some of the ways in which these devices and a broader digital revolution has both eroded people's capacity to socialize and is dividing young women and young men from one another. Probably the country this is most salient on that latter point would be, what would you guess? South Korea, yes, sir. Exactly, right. So again, this is kind of unfortunately, it's a sort of a global challenge that's sort of playing out. Okay, so the road ahead as we wrap up this talk tonight, wrap up this lecture tonight. And I want to kind of just be very clear with the young adults here in the back of the room that I think it was easier for Jody and for me as we kind of like wandered through college and wandered through our 20-somethings to meet people, to date, and then marry and have a family. For a variety of reasons that should kind of now be apparent to you. In terms of just, it was a different social context, it was a much less technologically inflected context, among other things. And so I think the 20-somethings or late teens who are here in this room just need to be a lot more intentional about the road ahead than we were coming up, okay? Because I think it's gonna be a lot easier to fall into this roadway where there isn't like a future with, you know, marriage and family than it would have been before. So you have to be more deliberate about kind of making choices that'll put you on the road to a family future. I could say a lot of things about what you might want to do, but let me just quickly give you 5 rules linked to 5 virtues. Again, given that the founders talk about the importance of virtue and happiness. So the first rule is about kind of, you know, men, teenage boys, just kind of encouraging them to embrace the virtue of industriousness. Okay, the virtue of industriousness. Again, as the founders were telling us that happiness really is found in cultivating virtues, the pursuit of happiness. And so for teenage boys and young men, it's really important to kind of get off the Game Boy and to, you know, embrace, you know, learning in high school and college or trade school. Figure out what you're good at, what really interests you, what motivates you. Develop some real, you know, gifts and talents, and figure out how they can kind of lead to a vocational path that will give you a stronger sense of self-worth and also will be helpful on the dating, love, and marriage front. Because it's still the case, again, even in 2026, that women are attracted to men who are, clearly decent, providers. There's a strong relationship, for instance, in the data between men being employed full-time and then getting married, right? So the point is we have to help our younger men do better on that virtue of industriousness with an eye towards being, a reliable provider. Now, I'm not saying your women can't work. I'm just sort of saying we have to sort of have an expectation of our teenage boys and young men that they're kind of more intentional about developing, talents and gifts, and more broadly a spirit of industriousness that will make them an attractive provider down the road. That's rule number one. The second rule has to do with kind of not being like my RA 2 years ago. I will call Keith, okay? And when I asked Keith to kind of give me a sense of his professional future, it was very detailed. I was going to work in Atlanta for 2 years, get an MBA, and then do this in some consulting sector. Very clear map of where he wanted to go professionally, Keith had, okay? But then I asked him, would you like to get married? Yes, I'd love to get married. Like, what's your plan for getting married? Silence. There was no plan. Asked him, Keith, are you dating anyone? No. Okay. So again, that's probably not going to cut it, especially today. So the second rule is about asking her out, okay? Encouraging guys to embrace the virtue of courage, to be brave in asking someone out, recognizing that they might fail, probably will fail, that's fine, but they might not as well. And I offer here the story of Arthur Brooks, who is now a professor at Harvard and director of their Harvard Happiness Lab. Pretty exceptional guy. And this is his story quickly. She was 25, I was 24. We spent only a couple of days together. He met her in Barcelona when he was playing for a band. And we shared no language in common. When I returned to the US from that European music festival, I announced to my parents that I had met my future wife. And he says this, of course, I had to convince Esther first. So I tackled the project as if it were a startup. I began by studying Spanish. Before long, I quit my job and moved to her native Barcelona, where I knew no one except her in hot pursuit. The market pressure was intense. Men would shout wedding proposals to her from moving cars. But I pressed on, undeterred. It took 2 years to close the deal, but she finally said yes, and we married. And now Arthur and Esther live in the suburbs of Boston, have a couple of kids, and they've been married actually now they have a grandchild, they've been married more than 30 years. So the point here is you have to kind of encourage guys to be more, again, kind of courageous on this issue of dating. Recognizing that it's pretty important kind of getting the ball rolling. Now, you may be asking yourself, but why is he saying why is it that guys should be kind of doing this? And I would just say 3 things quickly about, this question. The first is that practically women tend to do more what's called relationship work, including young adult relationships. They're often left kind of bearing more of the burden in their relationships. So it's kind of nice to give guys some tasks, to accomplish in a relationship. And this is certainly an important task. You're going to get the ball rolling here. Okay. The second thing that I would say is it does require courage. And this is a trait that women actually value more than men in a partner. So it's good for guys to cultivate the virtue of courage by asking someone out. You could do that in person. That's the most courageous move. You could call them. That's pretty courageous still today as well. Or if need be, just DM them and just to kind of take that initiative, be courageous. And then the third point that I would say here is that studies suggest that women prefer that men kind of inaugurate things in this way. So I've said 2 things about kind of, or 2 rules that are targeting more men. Let me say something to the women about, in a sense, sort of helping the ball get going here. We have here, of course, who is this? Famous BBC series, Miss Elizabeth. Yes, okay. So I'll come back to that point in a second. So Dr. Deborah So is an evolutionary psychologist, tells women to signal their interest. She says, quote, look him directly in the eyes and smile very obviously at him. Adding, quote, a smile operates like a giant high beam, signaling to the other person that they should approach instead of avoid. So that's sort of part of the story here. But also, this brings us back to Miss Elizabeth. They, I think, could do more in terms of not being too picky. We saw kind of in that discussion of online dating from Scott Galloway, and kind of letting things play out, even if they're, in this Elizabeth's case, prejudiced against Mr. Darcy. She was not initially at all kind of, favorably inclined to him. But as she got to know him over time, her heart softened and her interest increased. She got to know his character, right? So the point here is just kind of give the men in your circle a chance, even if you're not initially attracted to them, and then also kind of like maybe, the first date doesn't go great, but maybe there's a slight possibility to kind of let yourself go on a second date would be kind of thought. But anyways, just to kind of exercise here the virtue of magnanimity, which is kind of the ability to see the good and the potential in others. In this case, potential partner and spouse down the road. Okay, the fourth rule, there's just 5 tonight, is don't wait too long. This is probably the most controversial thing that I say in my class in the sociology of family at UVA. We know that folks are getting married around 30 today, but I'm encouraging my students to think about a 20-something marriage, broadly defined, recognizing that, yes, you often get more mature in your mid-20s, for instance, but you're not too settled in your ways. You've become kind of too much accustomed to kind of doing things your own way as a permanent bachelorette, in a sense. And you haven't has kind of much opportunity to move in and out of a series of relationships and to kind of maybe accumulate some drama that might color your marriage as well. And we do see that folks are getting married in their 20s, and for instance, in this study of women, are more likely to be in that very happy category in green at the top here. But the other point, and I just made this in a piece that was published yesterday, called Get Married Young, is that, again, because I think things are becoming more challenging when it comes to dating, when it comes to the whole relationship landscape, that it's better not to overlook the possibility that you might find someone in college or in graduate school or in your early 20s, because there's no guarantee that someone's going to magically appear when you turn 28 or 29 who will be, a good spouse and a good family member, down the road. So again, be open to a 20-something marriage, and if you're in college right now, just to be, I think, more attentive to the opportunities that are here at this university. And the fifth and final rule is to sort of be cognizant, too, of the fact that, love and marriage are wonderful things. I've been kind of stressing the positive so far tonight, but they're also difficult, as we all know. I mean, there are days, there are weeks, there are months where I've been frustrated or angry with my wife, Danielle, or she's been frustrated or angry with me as well. And having kind of something that's able to sort of ground and guide our marriage, that's sort of bigger than us, deeper than us, more important than us, has been extremely helpful in our marriage. And we do see that kind of both the networks that religious folks enjoy, the norms that they're exposed to, norms like fidelity and forgiveness, and what's also called in the sociological research literature by Peter Berger, who Jody knows well from back in the day, the nomos that we see in religious context is this idea that there is a sort of a sacred canopy that stands over people. And if you kind of have the sense that there is a God in this, or God sort of governing this world, you're kind of better able to handle the swings and arrows of misfortune that are going to come at you both in life and in your marriage and family as well. So for these reasons, in part, couples who are religious are more likely to be flourishing. They're more likely to be getting married here in the first place. It's a big effect. They're more likely to be very happy in their marriage. It's a pretty big effect in kind of the marital happiness research. And they're also less likely to be getting divorced. These are big effects as well in the research too. So we can see here that religion, or the virtue of faith, if you will, is linked to greater marital success down the road. But I acknowledge that probably not everyone here is religious, and I just make the point in this sense that birds of a feather flock what? Together, exactly. And so if you are not religious, if you don't have a religious bone in your body, the other thing that I would say is that just be very kind of careful about who you're hanging out with as a friend. Because there's just a ton of social science research telling us that you end up being your friends on so many different outcomes. Okay? So if your friends are the kinds of people who are good spouses and good parents, you're likely to be the same. Or even if they're a single person, but they're clearly respectful of people's relationships and whatnot. We all know that there are other people out there who are not good spouses, not good parents, or who are single and doing things that are not really conducive to having a good marriage and a good family life, right? So the point here simply is, beyond just the religious point, rule number 5, is just to sort of recognize that, again, birds of a feather flock together, and so given this, you should be kind of deliberate about kind of who you're living with in friendship, because that'll affect potentially, in important ways, your future success when it comes to love, marriage, and family. Okay, so following rules like the ones that I've articulated tonight will help put young men and women on the road to love and marriage. Equally important, they will also help them cultivate the virtues that make them excellent husbands and fathers, wives and mothers. And this, my friends, is why these rules of the relational road are also most likely to secure them a shot at that most Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness.